Hi, I'm State Senator Guy Gazzoni from Howard County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, your weekly dive into the policies and personalities driving local government in Maryland.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, we're going to run a format that we ran, I think, it was maybe last fall, and we're going to do that again today. And I think our listeners might like it, maybe not, who knows, but I think we have a pretty good episode for today. We're going to do kind of a wrap up on a lot of things. The news or noise segment is what people are here for, Michael.
Right. I like that. We did one round of this, I feel like it was maybe an end of November last year before session winds started really blowing, that sort of thing. But, a few of us got together and kind of ran through 8 or 10 different topics and said, is this a real story or is it not? So I dig it.
So let's try and do a post-session wrap up with that in mind, the news or noise concept, Michael, and I'll let you go first.
Well, okay, this feels like old times, right? You and I have done this podcast with the two of us, I don't know, scores of times at this point. And back in the day, we would get together and frequently talk about all the budget and fiscal stuff. Like we'd circle a week or two after the legislative session to kind of break down the budget, the reconciliation bill, all that stuff. Like we're both into this sort of stuff. That was my beat back when I was in your shoes professionally. You're, I think, even closer to those issues than I was in your shoes. So, that seems like the obvious place for us to start. But I'm not sure if there's a whole podcast episode there for you and I to do that. I don't think we've got 15 things to break down like we sometimes do.
No, we did an episode with a couple weeks left in session, and we talked through some of the big issues affecting counties. And for the most part, things just stayed on course. Mostly what the Senate did, they took in conference, right? So there's not a ton of big news to break. I agree with you there. I don't think there's a whole episode. I think if you go back a few episodes and listen, but it kind of fits into the narrative. I think our colleagues did the session wrap up, and it was a weird session. It seemed like, there wasn't a ton going on in the second half, and that goes for the budget as well. It was quickly passed. I think it was the quickest budget they've passed in a long time. Wasn't a ton of fanfare. So I agree with you, Michael. You can just go back a few episodes and listen to the podcast we did breaking down the budget.
Yeah, as far as the county effects, that's definitely the case, and I agree with you. No late session drama on fiscal issues. Where contrast with the 24 session, or excuse me, the 25 session, where I feel like we waited an extra week or two to even pull the plan together, and down to the last 5 or 6 days, it was unclear how things were going to fall together. So I don't know. It goes that way, but I would say if you're interested in the details of what happened in the state fiscal package, if you weren't at the MDGFOA conference last week where we broke all that sort of stuff down, there's a lot of write-up on the Mako Conduit Street blog, a lot of content there. Kevin wrote his usual article, sort of nuts and bolts, all this kind of stuff. The General Assembly has published their 90-day report, and that's always a treasure trove of what happened sort of small bit by small bit. So there's places to get all that. I think let's skip the 30 minutes of going through nuts and bolts like that. Let's get into stuff that we find maybe more interesting post-session.
Well, kind of on that note, one big picture comment that I keep coming back to, it feels like a bunch of the biggest issues, like transportation issues, right? How we're going to fund transportation moving forward, things like local revenue flexibility, although there was some movement there in terms of a study, a work group. But some of the bigger fiscal decisions that we're invested in kind of hit pause this session, right? And, not nothing, but not the kind of structural stuff that actually solves the problem. So, Michael, news or noise, are we punting big ticket items until after the election?
So I don't know. I don't think I mean this in a disparaging way, but I think as a practical matter, yes. I think there's a fair number of big topics that the resolution just didn't feel ready. So the idea of the state going in and sorting out all the moving pieces of their entire budget plan, it just the wherewithal wasn't present this session. So I'll take that as news. I think it's a real thing, but maybe kind of deliberately, it's not news in the old school sense. So, above the fold, front page, big letters. Oh my gosh, here's the budget. It's exactly not that kind of news because steering the ship in generally the same direction as it had been pointed, that doesn't get your dime. You don't run to
Right.
grab the copy of the newspaper for that. I know I'm talking like 100-year-old man here, but I mean,
No,
that doesn't move any copy, right? It was
no,
kind of deliberately non-news, and that's the news.
makes sense. And to me, it does absolutely lean news because I know like the fiscal picture is tight, no question. Everybody knows that. But these aren't new problems. Transportation has a real funding gap.
Yeah.
Counties still don't have meaningful flexibility on revenue. We know that reliance on property taxes isn't popular. Those pressures didn't just start this year and they're not going to go away next year. So for me, and again, a lot of the stuff that's embedded in energy policy, and we'll get into some energy stuff, it feels like we definitely kicked the can down the road a little bit there. There's still a lot of uncertainty in Washington in terms of how the federal government is going to interact with Maryland, some controversial court decisions coming down the road, maybe from the Supreme Court. So it's not like nothing happened, but a lot of this feels like we're positioning ourselves for the next conversation rather than finishing this one.
I think that's probably the right way to put it. And I would say to continue that same line of thinking, if you look forward to the 27 session where they're going to be putting together the FY 28 budget, I mean, this is when suddenly the blueprint, the big 10-year education plan we're sort of in the middle of rolling out, that needs to be funded out of the state's general fund. The balance sitting in the education trust fund has been drawn down, and so they'll need general fund dollars to fund the education plan. And the arithmetic just looks terrible for that. So if you buy that, okay, this year being something of a punt, I'll take that as news. But if you're saying, well, maybe they're just never going to solve this, they'll just kick the can forever, I think that is actually noise. Like the reckoning is coming, and I think it's like less than a year away.
Right. And we've talked about the issue right, where these numbers balloon. It is because the blueprint and those casino revenues go away and you have to start pulling money out of the general fund. So I agree. I don't know how you can get past that. I think that alone makes this that they have to address the issue. But I can also understand people who say, well, we hear this all the time, right? Well, next year is going to be the year, and there's always ways they can nickel and dime. But I do think, Michael, just because of the blueprint, which, by the way, does have some sort of audit coming, right? That's another thing that's after the election. They have to
Yeah.
look at the blueprint. And I think it'll be interesting to see, how that goes in terms of, do we need to move things around? Do we need to cut certain things? Do we need to extend deadlines for certain things? How can we make this work that's more feasible without derailing everything else? Because we know it is such a big ticket item in terms of budgets. But I agree. I think the numbers are just too big. I really think they have to solve it, right? So the whole
Right.
picture kind of relies on the blueprint and what they do there. And it seems like blueprint, fiscal picture generally needs a kind of a reboot.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at the whole thing. And there are reasons to actually like do this stuff in big packages. Maryland has a history of saying, okay, like we've kind of whistled past the graveyard long enough with our transportation shortfall, and
Mhm.
we're going to do that at the same time we're doing this other big initiative for school construction or whatever. Like you bundle these things together and you take your medicine and you bring together some deliverables and do multiple things at the same time. I mean, there's a PhD thesis to be had about the political advantages of doing lots of hard things in back-to-back sequence rather than scattering them out across a 4-year term. I
Mhm.
think we're set up for that. Yeah.
Right. So I have another one for you. And this is from the session itself. In the final hour or two of this year's session, we saw some pretty aggressive back and forth on the floor of both the Senate and the House, Michael. And that was kind of big news.
Right. And these days, like the coverage isn't just, some reporter trying to write down what happened and who said what and so forth. But I mean, you don't have to wait for the morning after newspaper, but here I am again, grandpa. But it's like live video from the floor, especially in the House of Delegates,
Mhm.
posted on social media like minutes later of, you wouldn't believe what I just saw here on the floor. Here's my live video. And here's like 4 minutes of video posted to social media, at 12:05 a.m. So like immediate gratification for people watching this sort of stuff. But yeah, some high pressure there.
Yeah, and for people watching it live, it certainly was abnormal to see. I think at one point the minority leader tried to take his party off the floor. There was yelling, screaming. We're not used to that, but in our news or no or our noise or news format, Michael, was the carrying on from the floor on Monday night at the end of session a big deal? Was it important? How do you read that, and does it like flow into the next session?
Yeah. For the most part, I think I want to go with, I think this is noise. I don't think it's that big of a deal. In part because, in large part, because I think it's like these things happening is actually a logical and predictable outcome from some stuff with parliamentary procedure. So you'd be shocked to hear that I own a personal dog-eared copy of Robert's Rules of Order, right?
No, I'd be shocked if you didn't, and shocked if you didn't own multiple copies of that edition.
I don't think our listeners would be shocked by that either. But okay, so I think in the aggregate, here's what I would say. This is how the system is mostly supposed to work. The tricky situation is some bills are on the floor and the legislative leadership is trying to get things passed in literally the last 1 hour of the 90-day session.
Right.
And both the Senate and the House, they have their own rules. They more or less follow conventional parliamentary procedure, like the Roberts Rules book. That's basically a structure of priority of motions and all that kind of stuff. It's just a set of rules that you all agree on up front so that everybody gets heard and you make decisions in the right sequence and organization and so forth. But the one thing that parliamentary procedure usually assumes is that you kind of have infinite amount of time. And so the right way to resolve this is you have this motion made, and then you have the appropriate debate, and then the majority side prevails, and then you've now settled that question, and you go back to the basic question. That's the kind of stuff that's layer after layer in parliamentary procedure and in Robert's rules and so forth, and in the rules of the House and the Senate in Maryland.
So in a
Um,
perfect world, if you had unlimited time, all these there wouldn't be a problem. Like everything should be orderly. But again, we don't have unlimited time, especially when you're looking at a 90-day session with a midnight deadline.
Right. And so yeah, at the end of the legislative session, these things that are meant to be fair process can start to feel unfair. Like, for instance, like the one thing that popped up late this session was the privilege of standing up and explaining why you
Mhm.
voted the way you voted on a vote that's just about to be taken is a normal thing. We see that, in both the Senate and the House on the floor.
Mhm.
Members will stand up and say, "I'm really proud to vote for this bill. I was concerned about this one thing, but the committee made the change, and because of that change, I've moved from a no to a yes. I'm so happy to be on this side. I'm really glad we worked that out." And like that adds context and flavor to a vote, and that sort of thing is fine. At 11:56 p.m.
Mm.
on the last night of session, when your rules state you drop the ball and you gavel out at midnight, like it or not, having 10 people want to stand up and explain their vote for a minute apiece is basically just saying, I want to kill the next five bills.
Right.
And so at some point, you have a tricky balance between following the rules to the T or trying to establish fairness in the process when you have everybody's voted for this bill and the piece of paper is in the hand of the presiding officer. Do you go through those motions and kill the next five bills, or do you call the question, bring the next bill up, and call that final vote? That's a tough call. The speaker has some judgment when she's presiding on the floor of the House over whom to recognize and for what purpose. And there was some aggressive back and forth about her decision to do that. If they had 3 hours, there's a process on the floor for appealing a decision of the presiding officer. You make that a majority vote question of the body, and anytime the presiding officer can be overridden by a majority, but you don't have that with 3 minutes to go. So I think in the aggregate, these are issues that they should be water under the bridge. This should go away, given just a little bit of time. It wasn't personal. It was about the substance and about the process, and that stuff just disappears with time. I don't think it's a sign of poor work by the presiding
Mhm.
officer in either chamber, anything along those lines. It's just the system has built-in tension when the rules say do this forever, and the clock says, but you stop at midnight.
Right. And, this is not, like you said, we're used to seeing that kind of thing on Sine Die, where, there are delay
Yeah,
tactics and stall tactics. And I guess, if I were devil's advocate, one could say, well, you need to build that in, right? It's coming. And so if you're really looking at the bills that you really want to pass, get them done at least earlier in the day. I know that always doesn't work out,
yeah,
right? There are always things that get in the way. But if devil's advocate would say, it's coming, and so to have that happen at the end, and you had people standing up who weren't, whatever the case, I agree
yeah.
it wasn't anything nefarious by the speaker. I think there was a lot going on, but I also can understand the other side saying, hey, we have a right to stand up, and I need to explain my constituents why I did this. But obviously, it was a delay tactic, and obviously, it would have killed some bills that were behind that bill. So I agree, tough situation, but I don't think it carries over into the next session. I'll agree with you there too.
Yeah, I mean, tough to disagree with that last point of yours, though. I mean, if you don't want your important bill to be at the mercy of the last 4 minutes of session, why don't you pass it on day 70 instead of 90?
Right.
I
And
know that's easier said than done, right?
right. Easier said than done, but I know a lot of people walking around would just say that if you were to put the
For
scenario to
sure.
them and say, why didn't you just do it earlier? Right.
Yep.
That would resolve the issue. All right. So moving on from that, in the fall, we had Carrington on and we got to talking football a little bit, and she schooled us on football. So let's again try some gridiron, even though we don't have Carrington with us. NFL draft was last week, Michael. The Ravens drafted a lineman first. A lot of controversy, I guess, on Twitter and some of the group chats you and I are in that we're talking about sports. Was that a smart decision by the Ravens? That's the first question.
So I'm a yes here. I think news. This was the right thing for the Ravens to have done. I think you build in the trenches, and it was a weakness last year. So you needed to do this one way or another. Paying a top tier offensive guard right now has become a 22, $24 million a year proposition. So this idea that you can't spend an early draft pick on an interior lineman, I think might be outdated thinking. And the Ravens are known for not worrying too much about the premium position. Just take the best player and then figure out who your best 11 are when the time comes. So I'm for it. I'm a yes. I'm in for that. That's news. Good call.
I agree. News, it is hard to argue building in the trenches. It's not a sexy pick, but it is how you stay good for a long time. And I think nobody wins the draft in April, but you can definitely lose the draft in April. And this was not that. You have guys like Lamar. You got to protect Lamar. Michael, I will say, though, just a few years ago, I think it was you telling me you were so excited about the Miami Dolphins and their draft, and that they were doing things the right way, and they were drafting all these linemen, and they were going to protect Tua. And I don't know. I don't know if you have any comment. I mean, Tua's gone. The whole thing kind of fell apart. But honestly, it looked like they were really setting themselves up and doing things the right way. But it just shows you how quickly things can fall apart, especially when you look at the Miami situation. I know you follow the Dolphins closely.
For sure. I do for random and pointless reasons, but I'm still a Dolphins laundry guy. So that's its own like
Yeah,
separate standalone episode of the podcast. I will hold court for 90 straight minutes on
I
the
know.
good and the bad with the Miami Dolphins front office, but at least they got rid of all the people that made all the mistakes that led up to this year. So new general manager, new head coach, new attitude, and now 35 new dudes on the roster because they're turning everything over. It's basically like tear it down to the studs.
All right. Well, things could be worse. It could be the Dolphins, right? So I think it was news though. The Ravens made the right decision. They didn't bend to the pressure to make those sexy picks, right? So back to policy stuff. We know that the General Assembly passed an omnibus energy bill this year. That was lots of news, big news, lots of moving parts. It's fair to say that we were not necessarily central players in that debate, but we did have some bits and pieces. But Michael, I want to talk about data centers because wow, if you want to get someone talking, just mention data centers, and there you go. Not a ton in this year's bill on data centers in the big omnibus bill, but here's my news or noise question. The amount of attention spent on data centers is just going to grow and grow. Agreed, Michael, because this is not like brand new. This has been for a few years. I think we've seen this brewing. This is going to be a big deal. There's a lot of money involved, but there are also other consequences, right? So do you think this is, news or noise, the amount of attention spent on data centers is going to grow and grow, or is it just going to fizzle out?
Yeah, this feels like an easy this feels like an easy answer for me. I think this is for sure news. That's really what's happening. I do think like a layer beneath the surface is a really interesting debate about whether data centers should be as big a part of this conversation about energy, about like electric bills and the
Yeah.
costs of and availability of energy. Like, do data centers really deserve this like center stage role in that? I think there's an interesting debate there, but knowing how easy it is to point at them and be mad at them and talk about
Mhm.
them, I think yes, it's just going to stay super hot, and I know it's going to come up. Mako goes out and meets with our our elected governing bodies from the counties over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, and I guarantee this will be a hot topic as we talk with them over the year. Yeah, this is news.
And a hot topic in so many different ways, right? Because depending on where you are, there might be a data center company or a big giant tech company trying to come in and take over a power facility in your county,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
maybe you're worried about water and power, right? You mentioned the impact that data centers have on electricity and electricity rates and prices. I will say, I think the one thing that's safe politically is to say that data centers should pay for their own energy, right? I think anybody could say that's probably, if you're an elected official and you're looking for something to say, I think right now that's probably the safest, that, well, they should definitely pay for their own power. Beyond that, though, there still is a lot of mystery. I think there's not a ton of information. And I think the General Assembly was wise in some ways to really say we need to take a step back. We don't want to make brash decisions. So we're going to get some new information in the fall. We'll come into next session and maybe we'll be able to put a stamp on this stuff. But it is such a controversial topic, Michael, and for so many different reasons. So I agree, news. We saw a ton of different bills around data centers, at least 10 to 15, everything from tax policy, we're talking about tax breaks or tax hikes, to environmental standards, to weird stuff like non-disclosure agreements. It was all on the table. Most of it punted to at least next session, Michael. So I agree, it feels like news.
Yeah. I mean, I think yes, this remains a big deal. And if in for the only reason you need for that to remain a big deal is I feel really confident electric bills are still going up. Even with this year's the relief bill and some calculated guesses on how much it's going to save a typical homeowners electric bill and so forth, just like the political pressure is still going to go up. So I'm buying like this is still a hot topic. We're going to see next year's after the election there will probably be new members of the legislature who used being angry about electric bills or about data centers or about AI as a centerpiece of their campaign. Right? Like, well,
Oh,
this is
yeah.
one of the reasons I'm here as a delegate now is because I talked to people in my community about these issues, and they said, "Get this dude to Annapolis." Right? That's going to
100%.
happen.
100%. And people who are not necessarily inclined to get into the political arena, an issue like this creates those advocates, right, that then do want to. And this is their central issue. Data centers, something like this, I think, is big enough, Michael. But I don't think anybody who knows this area well believes that if Maryland just shuts down building any more data centers here, that electric bills will stop going up, right? I don't think that that's a reality. But regardless, we do know the demand isn't going anywhere with AI, the cloud, all that stuff. So the question isn't if, it's how do you manage it, right? How do you manage it when it does come, regardless of the state? It's going to be a national issue for sure.
Spot on. And this is one of those topics that if we run a session on data centers and we put it at the Mako conference in August, it's going to be a packed room, guarantee it.
Absolutely. So let's move on to another topic I'm very invested in personally, emergency response and how do we fund it. So, Michael, we've talked a lot about on previous episodes, I think, what's going on with the feds and with FEMA and disasters. We had the issue out in Western Maryland where Maryland was denied disaster aid, even though we met all the benchmarks. And it seems like now there are states on the good list and states on the bad list, right? Depending upon your politics. So that should never be the case when we're talking about emergency management, Michael. But news or noise, right? That this was a big issue coming out of the session.
I mean, I think it's pretty easy that this is news. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, like you're in the middle of this. You're talking with our people on the ground, trying to run the local emergency management office and respond to these crises in Western Maryland, or the next the next tornado touchdown or whatever, flooding disaster. But like they're flipping out about this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, when you look at the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, it's mostly funded through the federal government. So a lot of that money that funds the state emergency management apparatus is federal money. And so when you turn off that spigot and things become political for whatever reason, and we start messing with money designed to respond and mitigate disasters, that's a big problem. And the people who do this work are consummate professionals. These are people who like to prepare for things, obviously. And so when they have this much unrest, it creates a big issue, both at the state level and the local level. And this, to me, should be front page news all the time because we're playing with fire, right? And when we see things like what happened in Western Maryland, local governments are on the front lines. We're the ones responding to this. The state did step in and help where it could, but the reality is no state has the ability like the federal government does to respond to large scale disasters and to put up the kind of money to mitigate these kind of disasters from happening. So I think absolutely our folks, our professionals on the ground who do this every day. I think I talk to like almost every day about what's going on, what's the latest, what are we hearing. NACO has a task force that's actually meeting. They're having a fly-in this week, I believe, talking to Congress about this, about the importance of making sure that we're prepared because nobody wants to, especially an elected official, I don't think anyone wants to be in the position where everyone's pointing fingers and looking around the room and saying, well, why didn't we prepare for this? Why aren't we ready? Why can't we respond? So I think it's a huge deal. The General Assembly did make some moves this year and help the state prepare. But to me, it's front page news all the time. It's certainly not noise.
Right. So I agree with you. It's encouraging that we saw sort of bipartisan collaboration on this during this past legislative session. And for that to happen even in an election year is
Right.
it's kind of like that's a good sign. So those are thumbs up for Maryland responding appropriately. But the setting we're in calls for a real solution. This isn't just posturing around, not just like,
No.
forgive me, but this isn't just like political opportunism to say we're angry with the current president or the current administration. Like
Right.
Maryland needs a genuine answer, a long-term, stable, ready-to-go system to respond with money, not 7 months later when the legislature comes to town and we can pass a bill, but you should have something ready to go to help those businesses or families or people who just got who just got devastated. You got to be able to make the promise in 24 hours and show up with a check in a week, right? Or whatever. I'm trying to talk the talk
Yeah.
like I know this stuff, but like that's what you need to be able to do. And if FEMA's not going to be there, then we've got to be there.
And I will like to not to toot Mako's horn, but for our emergency managers who, just a few years ago saw this coming, right? Even in a different administration, we knew that we had a tornado in Annapolis, and that wasn't enough to trigger like a large scale disaster response from the feds, but it was enough to where the local governments didn't have the resources available to get money out the door quickly to people and businesses, right? So we got a bill passed to establish this sort of statewide disaster relief fund where if an emergency didn't rise to the level of a presidential disaster declaration, there was still a pot of money that, didn't have a bunch of strings attached to it where you could get the money out quickly to people who needed it very, very quickly. So we kind of saw what was coming, and it was nice to see that fund was used in Western Maryland when the feds did not show up, and that we passed a bill this year to make it even easier to get money transferred into that fund when there is an emergency that requires money to get out the door quickly. So kudos to our emergency managers for seeing around the corner on this one, but maybe it's not exactly what we expected, but it's nice to have that fund in place now. But certainly that's not enough to be prepared for when a hurricane comes up the bay or whatever the case may be. That's what keeps our people up at night, and not having that reassurance that the feds will show up is a nightmare scenario, not just for Maryland, but for every state. So we're not the only state dealing with this, but certainly it's a huge concern.
Right. With you there. Right. Big news.
Yeah, big news. All right, so let's get into another timely topic, Michael. This Saturday is the Kentucky Derby. Who you got?
All right. So our favorite little like Preakness prep race they hold over there in Kentucky. I mean, if you want, like I've got probably a half hour of content on this. I'm ready to go. I'm recording. We're recording a few days before the Derby. We got the position draw. I got lots of thoughts. How much you want here?
I know you have like papers on the walls and pens and
the yarn and everything.
Yeah, the whole deal going on. But maybe we should put a pin in it, and no pun intended there. And maybe that's one for the Patreon page. Michael, your whole analysis, but can you give us just, you got the free pick. Give us a free pick, and then we can send everybody to your paid content later on.
Okay. All right. I'm interested in, so typically like my friends are used to having to hear like my whole 6 minute story on how some crappy horse has some chance to win this race. And it's always thought if you saw this and if you believe that and then look at this one, well, I
No,
don't have a long,
those people have
yeah,
lost all their money, Michael. They're no
yeah,
longer employed.
I know, I
So
know.
we feel bad for the people who have taken betting advice from this podcast. I'll go ahead and put the disclaimer right now. Do not take betting. Do not take this as betting advice.
You don't think that's it? Okay. So anyway, here's what I'll say. I think among the logicals, I think there's a horse who basically has no X's, and I like to see that. He's got a very good form. He looks like he's working out sharply. He's handled traffic. He looks like he's got a pedigree to run a nice distance. This horse is named Further Ado. He's going to run from a little ways outside, which I kind of like. He's not going to run to the front. He's going to want to work his way in, but being from an outside post, it's 20 wide. That's kind of crazy for a horse race, and being on the outside gives you a chance to settle in the middle or push things and be in the second rave or whatever. He could be either of those, and that's fine. I think he looks every bit sharp enough to win this race, and I don't know, 7, 8 to 1, somewhere in that neighborhood seems like a nice sweet spot. So if you see Further Ado and they're going up and painting the weather vane and naming him as the winner, he's going to go on the Derby glass for next year. I'll see at the cashier's window, cashing maybe a $15 or $18 win ticket.
I
Further
like that.
Ado, yeah.
I like that. Well, I mean, I don't have anyone locked in as deeply as you have, but I do like Chief Wallaby.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
yeah, he feels like the right kind of, he's a mid-range horse, not too overhyped, but I think he'll be right there when the favorites wobble, Michael. And I do like your horse. I do like Further Ado, but I think Chief Wallaby, he's not, some, huge dog, but he's up there with the favorites, but I think he's more of a mid-range and I like him a
Yep.
lot.
Yep. And you got some classic breeding there to suggest that he wants all of the mile and a quarter, and
Yes.
not everybody in this field has that. So
He
I
wants
like
to
it.
go.
I
He
like it.
wants to
Okay,
go.
so if we want to frame this as news or noise, maybe I'll pull back up your earlier comment. News or noise, it's a great idea to take handicapping picks from a couple of rando guys who are doing a podcast about Maryland policy. News or noise, that's a great idea.
Well, I'll say it's probably noise, but there are plenty of people who have quote unquote podcasts and are giving out picks, and I guess people are
That's
taking
true.
those picks. So we could just be two random dudes giving out picks on a policy podcast. We'd probably be just as well as most of the podcasts giving out picks. So it is definitely noise. Do your own homework, but we might be better than your average two. Just because of Michael on
Yeah.
horse racing, at least we're probably better than the average.
Hey, I have a late breaking insight. If you want to show, like this is an exclusive. You heard it here.
Exclusive.
So Taylor and Travis have purchased a 10% interest in one of the horses in this year's Kentucky Derby, named the Puma. So the 9 horse in this field is going to end up with a bunch of crazy money from all these
Wow.
Swifties, right? Like, when she plays in Milwaukee, suddenly the Wisconsin economy booms for 3 days. I'm telling you, we all make money by betting against the Puma.
You're
Nothing
right.
against them, but if all the Swifties just do whatever she says, they're all gonna. My daughter's gonna put money on the Puma, so everybody else is gonna be an overlay. We can all win here.
I feel bad for the jockey if he doesn't win. I'll just say that because you don't want the wrath of the Swifties. I do know that much, right? You
True,
do know that.
true.
So that is an interesting insight though, Michael. So all the money now is going to come in on the 9, and we know why. So you learned that here on the Conduit Street podcast that Travis, Kelsey, and Taylor Swift have purchased a stake in the Puma. All right. I like that. All right, Michael. So I like this setup a lot. I think if we're going to do it every so often, I like it better with our colleagues in the fold with us. We had Carrington breaking down football. I know that Dom and Sarah also can hold their own on just about any topic. So what do you think? You agree that we need to
Yeah.
get our colleagues on for the news or noise segments?
I like it. I like the dynamic of 3 of us. It's more opportunity for us to bicker rather than agree. You and I tend to have our horoscopes in alignment. So,
True.
I think it's better. Let's bring in a third voice, someone who will tell us we're idiots and to pound sand. That's maybe a good element.
That's always a good element. That's always a good element. And I think that's where we can leave it with all the breaking news with Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift and their stake in horses. I think we've given our listeners enough for today. Don't take this as betting advice. Again, do your homework. But I do think we have some good horses for you. But we'll leave it there. And as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, read the Conduit Street blog. We referenced it earlier. We have a ton of post-session wrap-up there. So you'll find everything you need to know about the 26th session there, and then looking forward to 27. But for Michael Sanderson and our esteemed producer, Chantal Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off for now, and we will talk to you soon.